Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our advanced training classes and the continuation of the gastrointestinal system and diseases related to that. So today I wanted to kind of go over Viruddha, which is the incompatible foods. We didn't get a chance to go over this, but as you all very well know, this is very important issue, and you come across a lot of incompatibilities um, over time and with your clients. Also, there's sometimes this can be contradictory as well, because things that we think or we've heard of in other sciences or in other methods of like holistic health, they talk about incompatibilities. In Ayurveda, if you look at all the incompatibility types, it seems like we can't eat anything at all. So it seems, sometimes it can be very restrictive. But there is a specific description as to why these foods are incompatible and why they do not meld very good together and therefore produce unwanted effects. So we're just going to kind of go through that today. I'll just quickly go through the types of Viruddha, and just so that you're hearing it and you hear the terms if you don't know them already. And then I really want to kind of go over the effects of Viruddha as per Ayurvedic classical text, because that's the important part, especially when we're studying pathology, because this is one of the major pathologies that you kind of find across the board when it comes to a lot of different disorders. So it's not only pertaining to the GI disorders, but you will find this coming up again and again in some of the later modules as well. Okay, so what is Viruddha? Viruddha is defined as, and as per Charaka and Ashtanga Sangraha, they define Viruddha as that combination of food that immediately causes an increase in the doshas inside the body and does not allow it to be expelled out. So, for instance, we know that, if we consume certain types of food, they have certain qualities or gunas, and therefore that slowly can also increase or affect the doshas with similar gunas, right? However, Viruddha, that combination causes an immediate increase of the doshas, and it does not cause the doshas to be expelled out. It also has antagonistic qualities to the dhatus. So if we consume or habitually consume these Viruddha, it can hinder the development and the nourishment of the dhatus, which we had looked at during the weekend. The importance of how food being properly metabolized and broken down then can further go on to the second stage of metabolism and digestion to then form newly healthy tissues or dhatus, and also nourish the already existing dhatus. Okay? Another description of why Viruddha is so important is that they say that Viruddha, it affects the balance between the body, mind, and the soul. And it also has the effects of Gata Visha, which is considered like slow poisoning. So for instance, if you are consuming any one of these Viruddha combinations or these incompatible combinations on a habitual basis, it's similar to taking a small amount of poison every single day till it finally builds up to produce an effect. So a good example of that we know very well is like pesticides. Or all of these wonderful food additives and coloring and all these wonderful things that are there in food that we are very well exposed to. And habitual consumption of that and overconsumption of that does produce unwanted effects in the body. We may not see it immediately, but it just keeps building and building and building till one point or the other, it is going to start to show effects. And then we don't really necessarily think, oh, well, it could have been because I was, eating ramen noodles for for 5 to 6 years, or I'm sorry, that was just an example that came to my head. Nothing against ramen noodles, but you know, if it has high preservatives and it has all of these other additives, then habitual consumption of that can lead to many disorders. And we are now coming to know that it does have a responsibility, or does have a causative factor for disease. Okay, so as per Charaka Samhita, he's the one who described in detail all the various types of Viruddha. In fact, he's listed 18 different methods of incompatible combinations, or foods that can produce this unwanted effect. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go through them. So the first one is Desha Viruddha, which means Desha is the habitat or the place where we're collecting the food from. So the example is, for instance, combination of foods from different areas with opposing properties. For instance, if we were to take food from a desert region and mix it with the food from a very swampy region, then those are incompatible. They have incompatible qualities and they don't really mix well together. Another example of that is, for instance, if we take seafood and mix it with tubers that grow in sort of mountainous areas, that's again, they're opposite qualities. So they don't mix very well together. And therefore consuming that means, for instance, if we look at the breakdown of it, again, they're opposite qualities. So when you're consuming this, your Agni has to then further break that down. And the problem is your Agni can't regulate its strength according to the different types of food that's there in the stomach at the same time. That's why it's really important for the breakdown and for the amalgamation of the food that happens when you're cooking it, that breaks down in sort of an even, homogeneous sort of mixture. So when you consume that, your Agni has the ability to break that down in one steady intensity. It doesn't need to have a higher intensity of Agni to break down, for instance, raw food combined with cooked food. That's another type of Viruddha. So, you know, it needs a higher intensity to break down the raw food and a lower intensity to break down the cooked food. And the Agni can't do that simultaneously. It's just going to have one intensity according to the Samanavata that has ignited it. So therefore, that the further breakdown, or the ahara rasa that is produced from this type of combination, becomes not the optimum ahara rasa, therefore again creating ama and creating malnutrition. Okay, so the next type of Viruddha is Kala Viruddha, or Kala means time, usually referring to season in this context. So for instance, if we are consuming foods that are contradictory to a specific season, that can also create or produce unwanted effects. So an example of that is consuming grounding and mucus producing food in the spring, because we know in the spring kapha tends to be more aggravated naturally, and if we are consuming foods that also produce the same sort of qualities or enhance the qualities of kapha, then that can obviously further aggravate kapha than it's already aggravated. So this is Kala Viruddha. This is incompatible according to the season. Agni Viruddha is food incompatible according to the Agni. So for instance, the example here is if you were to take Clare soup for someone who has Tikshna Agni, or I am the perfect example of that, which you all saw this weekend. if I eat very light food and I have a very strong Agni, then therefore that's not going to be compatible, because it's not significant or substantial enough for the intensity of the Agni. So therefore you need to eat food that is compatible with the strength or the intensity of the Agni. Okay? The next is Matra Viruddha. Matra here means quantity. So the combination of foods according to quantities that it produces undesirable effects. So we've learned about earlier, just in general, when we looked about Viruddha and incompatible foods, we know that equal quantities of ghee and honey actually does not mix well together. It's similar to the mixture of oil and vinegar, they just don't mix well together. It's the same thing. Ghee and honey in equal quantities, if you mix them together, it produces toxic effects. And what an example of the toxic effect is, it actually kind of induces vomiting, which is similarly what I had told you. The one exception for when we use Viruddha Ahara is when we want to induce these toxic effects. So for instance, when we mix ghee and honey in equal quantities and administer that to a newborn, it's to produce that unwanted effect of inducing vomiting, and therefore helping to cleanse out their GIT. Okay, so there are certain instances where we can use Viruddha for the same unwanted effect, where we're trying to induce the unwanted effect. But for the most part, if you're not trying to induce that, then it is considered incompatible, and it's considered slightly toxic. Okay, toxic in the sense that it produces unwanted effects. The next type of Viruddha is Satmya Viruddha, and this is a good one, because sometimes, you know, for instance, you tell people they have to eat a certain diet or they have to eat certain foods, and they just don't like it. So this is an example of that. If food that is not familiar can produce undesirable effects. So the example that I put in here is, if you ask someone for England, of course I'm generalizing by saying that, I'm not saying all English people can't eat spicy food, but for the most part, if you imagine someone in a very rural area or the countryside of England, and you ask them to eat spicy Indian food, that's not going to sit well with them, and probably produce a lot of unwanted effects or severe irritation of their GIT. So the spices just don't work well with them. And we had talked about this as well over the weekend. You really need to ask people, how well do they respond to spices? Are they open to spices, or do they find it too hard to ingest that it produces severe reactions? So though ideally these spices or these herbs have a lot of medicinal value, but if it is not conducive to them, then they are going to have a severe reaction. So that would be considered as Satmya Viruddha. Okay. So the next is dosha viruddha, use of food with similar properties to that of the dosha, and therefore it causes further increase of the dosha. So for instance, if a Vata Prakriti person consumes or habitually consumes chickpeas, or for instance, hummus, which is made out of chickpeas, that would not be very good for them, because the chickpeas or the hummus has a property of producing more amount of gas, which is also similar qualities to that of Vata, and it further aggravates Vata. Okay, so that would be an example of dosha viruddha. The next is samskara viruddha, and samskara means the processing. So for instance, if you're processing foods in an inappropriate manner, it can cause it to become toxic. So an example of that, a classic example of that, is heating honey. By heating honey, actually you're further breaking down the natural enzymes that you get from the bees when they produce the honey. And also the fact that honey naturally is very ushna virya, or hot in potency, and by heating it, you're actually turning it into an extremely high hot potency substance, and therefore it is considered then to be in the realm of toxic substances. So you never want to heat honey. Okay, so that would be considered as samskara viruddha, because it's against the by processing it, you're making it into something that is produces unwanted effects. The next is virya viruddha, which means combination of foods with opposite or opposing potencies. So this is a very common one that we see. For instance, a classic example is fish and milk, combining fish and milk, because fish is hot in potency and milk is cold in potency. So by combining both of these together, they actually do not mix very well. They do not become a very homogeneous meal or preparation, and therefore it produces, again, unwanted effects. The next one is koshta viruddha, and koshta here means the state of the colon in one way, or how the colon reacts to certain types of food. So we have learned this earlier, and for instance, in certain types of prakritis, the type of koshta that they would have, or how they respond well to elimination of waste. So for instance, a vata prakriti tends to have a kruda koshta, or a sort of a dry koshta, where they tend to need or absorb more amount of water. So therefore, they're naturally prone to having constipation or gas, or sort of dry stools or hard stools. Pitta prakriti tends to have a mridu koshta, or a sort of a very mild soft koshta. So that's why they naturally tend to have more softer stools, or sometimes even more semi-solid, or sometimes even more on the liquid side, because their koshta is like that. Okay, so for instance, if you're consuming foods that are incompatible according to the koshta, that also produces an unwanted effects. This is a good example, for instance, of how we test to see if a certain person has a certain type of koshta. For instance, if a person has a mridu koshta, or a soft koshta, if they consume milk, it causes them to pass motions. It's very easy to induce bowel evacuation just by the consumption of milk. But however, if a person of a kruda koshta, or similar to vata prakriti, if they consume milk, it does not induce a bowel elimination. They need something much stronger. For instance, something like castor oil, that would induce a bowel evacuation. Okay. And for someone like who are a madhyama koshta, which is sort of like a moderate, not dry, not too dry and not too soft, then something like triphala would help to induce a bowel evacuation. So in the case of Viruddha, or incompatibility, if you were to give something like castor oil in a person who has a mridu koshta, or naturally tends to eliminate very easily, it would cause excessive elimination and similar presentation of that of dysentery. It would be uncontrollable bouts, sort of like inducing a virechana for that person. So castor oil would be too strong according to their koshta. The next example, or next type of viruddha, is avastha viruddha. And avastha means stage. So here in this context, the state of the body. So if we're consuming food that are incompatible according to the state of the body, for example, if you're consuming, again, grounding foods in a person who has a kapha vriddhi, or a kapha aggravated state, or for instance, if someone has ama and they're consuming oily foods, they are in ama avastha, and they're consuming something that's oily, that's very heavy to digest, and also has similar qualities to that of the ama, then what it does is it just further increases the ama. Okay, so according to the state of the body, if you're consuming foods that just actually aggravate the condition even further, then that is considered viruddha. Some of these seem very similar, and they're not necessarily exclusive, that it has to be just this one type or just that one type. They sound very similar, but it comes down to looking at how the food reacts in different ways. So for instance, you can have an example of one incompatible combination, and that may be considered under 3 or 4 different types of viruddha, and not just one. Okay. The next one is krama viruddha, and krama means the procedure here. So for procedure or timing of consumption of food. For instance, we talked about, the rules and regulations of how you're supposed to eat. So in that comes under this context. So for instance, we had talked about this as well, taking a shower after you eat a meal, and that's immediately after you eat a meal. That is according to the procedure and timing of when you should eat and when you should take a shower. It goes against that. So that's an example of, again, Viruddha according to the timing or the procedure of consuming food. Or for instance, again, sleeping immediately after eating a meal, that also we know is Viruddha, because it just it further aggravates kapha, and it further actually causes blocking of the channels. It turns into abhishandi, and abhishandi, Bhishand. Oh, sorry, I didn't type it out. Okay, I'll send it to you. Abhishandi is a term used for when, for instance, when you consume foods that start to block the flow of the channels, then that's the effect of, for instance, sleeping immediately after eating a meal, or also in the case of taking a shower after eating food. Okay. The next is parihara viruddha, which means, again here, consuming foods with opposite qualities. So for instance, not just necessarily the potency, but the actual qualities or the gunas here. So for instance, drinking hot coffee followed by cold water, they have different qualities, or eating cereal with milk and then drinking orange juice, they have, again, different qualities. So therefore, they don't mix very well and produce Viruddha effects. The next is upachara Viruddha, and that's, again, consuming foods or combining foods with similar qualities that make it hard to digest. An example of that is if you're taking, for instance, you're taking a cleanse and you're consuming ghee, and after you've consumed the ghee, then you drink cold water, then that just causes the ghee to congeal, and it doesn't really make it easier to digest. In fact, it makes it more difficult to digest. So that would be considered that's an example of upachara viruddha. The next is paka viruddha, or wrongful processing of food that turns it unhealthy. Or paka actually here means cooking, which we've talked about that as well. In this aspect, in this context, it's cooking externally. For instance, how you cook your food. So an example of that is eating half-cooked food, or al dente food that actually produces ama because it's not completely cooked. Okay, so paka viruddha is another example of the way we process food and how it would produce then unwanted effects. The next is samyoga viruddha, and here it means, again, food, exactly combination of food with opposite properties that render the dish unhealthy. So an example of that is sour foods such as radish or horseradish mixed with milk. It aggravates kapha. And this is a specific example, for instance, when it comes to skin disorders. So when we get to talking about kushta, or many different types of skin disorders or skin diseases that come under the realm of kushta, this is a specific nidana or causative factor for that, by consuming food with opposite properties that then aggravate the doshas that eventually end up manifesting in the rasa dhatu and rakta dhatu, therefore creating these signs and symptoms in the skin. Okay, so this is one specific example of a nidana for a disease, the samyoga viruddha. The next is hridaya viruddha, and that is eating unpleasant food or palatability. So this, again, this happens a lot actually with children. For instance, if you ask them to eat like bitter foods, they just don't like it. Or if you ask them to eat something that they really do not like the taste of it, eventually what will happen is if you force them to eat it, they'll vomit because they just do not like the taste. That's an example of hridaya viruddha. It doesn't taste good, so they don't like it, and that produces, again, immediate aggravation of the doshas. So another example of that, for instance, is food that is stale, that is not palatable, rotten food, or with an offensive odor that can cause you to have an immediate reaction. And this is another example, again, of a causative factor specifically for the disease termed as chardi, which means vomiting. Okay, so this is an example, again, of how it immediately causes an aggravation of the doshas. So for instance here, offensive odor, by the way, in Ayurveda, if you eat blue cheese, and some of you may love it, some of you may not, I'm one of those who don't really like it, but blue cheese is considered, it's rotten, it has fungus on it, and that actually is considered a Viruddha ahara because it is spoiled. So that would also come under this heading of Viruddha or Hridaya Viruddha. Sampad Viruddha is the quality of the food. So consuming food which is not mature, or for instance, again here, putrefied food is considered as Sampad Viruddha, the quality. So for instance here, the quality of the food, food with preservatives and with additives and coloring and genetically modified food, all of that would come under actually Sampad Viruddha. It's not the optimum quality of food, okay? And the last is Vidhi Viruddha, which is the wrongful procedure for consumption of food. So we had talked a little bit about this, the rules and regulations of how you eat. There was an even longer list that we didn't have time to talk about, but as you said, if we had talked about everything in concerning the GIT and concerning food, it would have taken us more than 4 days. That subject on its own could go up to at least 2 weeks to a month. So in this here, the wrongful procedure for consumption of food, it's, for example, eating while you're lying down. That is, again, a big no-no because it wouldn't allow for proper movement of the food from the upper GIT to the stomach, and then for proper breakdown in the stomach. Okay, so that's an example of Vidhi. Vidhi here means procedure. So the wrongful procedure for consumption of food. Okay, so those are the 18 types. All of this, again, is in your handout. We just went over what was there in your handout. Does anyone have any questions so far? I know this is a lot that I kind of just threw at you. If you have no questions, then I'll just briefly describe the effects of Viruddha. Okay? No questions? Okay. So, and the next page, there is the diseases that arise due to habitual consumption of Viruddhahara. So this is from Charaka Samhita, and he's described that, for instance, an example of this is Shandya, which is impotency, Visarpa, which is herpes, Visphota, which is pustules or other eruptions in the skin. Here again, the skin disorders. Unmada, which is psychological disorders. Bhagandhara, which is fistula in ano. Murcha, fainting. Mada, intoxication. Admana, which is the bloating and gas, similar to what we were talking about, where it looks like the person has either an abdominal tumor or it looks like a phantom pregnancy, where their abdomen is distended due to gas and bloating. That is the term that is used, admana. Or even when it becomes a full-on disease state, then it's known as gulma. Galagraha, spasmodic obstruction of the throat. So it feels like something's constricting in their throat. That is known as gala. Gala is the throat, and graha means the obstruction of the throat. Pandu is anemia. Ama visha, which is, we talked about briefly, it's one of the conditions where ama has now become a pathological state, and then it slowly progresses to become specific diseases. But in the beginning stages of where ama is there and it's starting to become chronic, the term that is used is ama visha. Kushta, a variety of skin disorders. A lot of different skin disorders actually come under the realm of Kushta because there are many different types of Kushtas. Shotha, which is edema. Grahani, we talked about that. Penasa is a chronic rhinitis, and Santana dosha. It can also go on to the next generation and become congenital disorders. So this is the effect of Viruddhahara. And actually, now that we look at it, it's funny that this concept has been around since the time of Charaka, but we are now starting to see in the past few years that the food that we eat can also affect our genetics and how it then affects progeny, a person's progeny, and it can pass on to the next generation. So the example of Santana dosha was already mentioned here in Charaka, which is very interesting that they were aware of that. Okay, Shushruta has just added a few extra in the effects of Viruddhahara, which is Vyadhi. Here it means almost all diseases. So if you're consuming Viruddhahara on a regular basis, or these type of combinations on a regular basis, it can be the basis for formation of any kind of disorder. Because as we've seen again, our food is the basis for the type of nourishment of our body, and therefore also the nourishment and production of ojas. So if we are consuming this sort of low quality, incompatible combination of foods, our body cannot break that down. Our body cannot make use of that type of food, and therefore it starts to affect each and every system. So therefore almost all types of vyadhis or all types of diseases can be associated back to Viruddhahara. Indriya Daurbalya, which Indriya is your senses, and Daurbalya means lack of strength or weakness. So weakness of the sensory organs. And Maranam, which means death. It can eventually lead to death as well. Garavisha, which is slow poisoning, has also the final effects is considered that it can lead to death. Okay, so the next is some common practices of Viruddhahara, which we kind of know by now that these are incompatible and do not work well. But I just want to go through the list and give you an example of exactly which type of Viruddha this comes under. So an example, the first one is milkshakes with fruit, smoothies. It's become so common, and hopefully by now you all know that smoothies are not really a good idea, especially when it comes to Ayurveda. We've gone down to the absolute breakdown of how smoothies do not work and are not really healthy for you, as well as raw juices are not really healthy for you. And the reason why it's not healthy for you is because you're consuming, or you're combining foods that have opposite properties and do not actually mix well together. So for instance, milk is cold in potency and it's sweet in taste, it's madhura, and some of the fruits that we add in are amla rasa, such as the citrus fruits, and therefore sweet and sour really do not mix very well together, especially when the sweet is milk. So that is considered as samyoga viruddha, or the combination there does not work. Similarly in fruit salad, so you would think, okay, well, if it's all fruit, it should be okay. But even in all fruit, there are different types of fruits with different tastes and different potencies. So for instance, if you're mixing pineapple with watermelon, they're opposites. And so it may seem like a very appetizing combination, but that also would not work. So that also can be a samyoga viruddha, and also a vidya viruddha as well. So juice cleanses, they're usually, sometimes when they make raw juices, they combine it again with fruits and vegetables. There are different tastes, so again, they do not mix very well together. Therefore, it becomes viruddha. And if you can, just as you would imagine, oil and vinegar, you're trying to mix these two together and you continuously keep shaking it, and the minute you stop, it starts to separate again. That's somewhat similar what happens in the stomach. You mix it up, you chew it, you try to break it down, you try to mix it together, and you swallow it, it goes down to your stomach, and then your stomach has to keep on churning and keep mixing it to try to make that congeal together, but it just doesn't, because they're opposites. They just do not mix. And that's kind of what they're describing in these different types of viruddhas. Okay. The next is, for instance, if you're consuming ice cream or alcohol after a meal, that again, the ice cream, of course, we can understand it just extinguishes the Agni, the Jatra Agni, and so therefore that is not good. Alcohol also after meals can, it causes too much of intensity of heat, so it actually aggravates the Pachika Pitta, so therefore that also is considered as incompatible. Okay, taking bath after a meal that we talked about and what that does, because it distracts the Agni from the work that it needs to be doing in the stomach of breaking down the food. Similarly, excessive exposure to sunlight after a meal, it's the same thing. If you are if you're standing out in the sun or sunbathing after you've had a meal, your body has to be distracted in trying to maintain your body temperature because of the external surroundings and cannot concentrate on digesting your food. And also we know that being out in hot climates and especially being out in the sun can actually lower your internal Agni, because again, it's lowering it to try and maintain your body temperature. And because of that, it's lowering the Agni, so therefore the food cannot be digested properly. Okay, so that's why that is considered as Viruddha. Next is consumption of milk, tea, or coffee after eating fish, and that's the reason why. It's because it's some of those can be cold in potency, plus you're having fish which is hot in potency, so that is considered as a Vidya Viruddha, and it does not work well. Consuming yogurt at night. Yogurt actually has, again, the same abhishandi property which we talked about. It blocks the channels, and in the nighttime, the flow or the movement in the shrotas tends to slow down. So if you're consuming yogurt at night, it further causes the slowing down or the blocking of the channels, blocking of the shrotas, and therefore it really reduces the amount of circulation that should be happening. So that's why it's considered Viruddha to consume yogurt at night. And this is actually a pretty common practice. For instance, my grandmother in India would never allow us to have yogurt at night. She's like, nope, that's not allowed. That you don't. There are certain things that are understood you do not eat at night, and yogurt was one of them. So this type of Viruddha is considered as Kala Viruddha according to the timing. Here also, Kala we talked about according to season, and here it also refers to the actual time. Okay. The next is honey and hot water. Again, the honey and hot water is Samskara Viruddha, because putting honey in hot water is almost the same as if you were to cook the hot water, or you're basically heating up you're cooking the honey, or you're heating up the honey. So that is considered as Samskara Viruddha. Cooked food that is refrigerated and then reheated. This is a hard one because this happens a lot. We see a lot of people, a lot of our clients who, just due to lack of time, they make food or they make dinner, they make a lot of it, stick it in the fridge, then take it out and have those leftovers for lunch the next day. And how do they reheat it? They stick it in the microwave and they reheat it, and they eat that. And that is actually considered as Paka Viruddha or cooking Viruddha, because what you're doing is, and also it's the Viruddha where we are looking at the staleness of food, because what happens is as you cook the food, there's a certain processing of the prana in food. Food has prana in it. Remember, we gain prana not only from breathing, but we also gain prana from the food that we eat. And what happens is when we refrigerate that and we recook that, we are further reducing the amount of prana that is there in that food. And so therefore, when we consume that food, there really isn't as much nutrition as there was when it was freshly cooked. And also what you're doing is, it's almost like as if you're burning off the nutrition from the food, which is basically as if, as I said earlier, you're basically getting rid of the prana in the food. So reheating refrigerated food or eating leftovers, definitely not a good idea. Okay, so reheating would be considered as a Paka Viruddha. The next is, as we mentioned before, food preservatives and coloring agents, those are Sampad Viruddha. It's according to it's lower quality of food. Next example is chicken and yogurt, and this is kind of hard because every kind of chicken tikka masala is made with chicken and yogurt. It's the only way to make it. However, again, they're both opposite viryas or opposite potency. Chicken is hot in potency, and yogurt is, they're similar potency. Chicken is hot in potency, and yogurt is always also hot in potency. And so by adding the two of them together, they're both hot and hot. They become too hot, or too ushna. Yes, hot, hot, hot. So it becomes upachara viruddha because of this similar potency. The next is leafy vegetables and butter. And you would think that actually sounds pretty good and very appetizing, but they're also the opposite viruddha. This one is opposite. Leafy vegetables can be more ushna in virya, and the butter is shita in virya, or cold in potency. So therefore, they do not mix well together. Okay. Similar beer and milk pudding. That's actually one of the classical examples straight out of Charaka, where if you're consuming beer or consuming these alcoholic beverages after consuming milk pudding, because it's, again, opposite potencies and opposite qualities, so they don't mix well together. And another example is bananas and yogurt. You would think that sounds pretty appetizing, and sometimes it's hard. If we look at this list, it seems like we can't eat anything at all. But if you're consuming it habitually, for instance, if you consume one Viruddha meal like once in a great while, that's not really going to be such a big issue. But if you're in the habit of having this every single day, which a lot of people are, and a lot of our clients do, and that can obviously start to affect their system. It can have a major impact in the type of nutrition and also their state of health. So this is really important for us to know, because this is going to give us an idea as to if this is the reason or the causative factor for their Agni being in such a low state, or for them to have ama, or for them to have these n number of diseases that follow because of the consumption of Viruddha ahara. Okay? So the next is the example exactly of specific disorders mentioned in classical texts that can arise because of Viruddha ahara. So an example of that is, the first one is kushta, or skin disorders. Amavata, which is a condition similar to gout, and also certain types of rheumatic fever, or even certain types of rheumatoid arthritis. So Vata Rakta is also rheumatoid arthritis and or gout, depending on the presentation of it. And also certain other autoimmune disorders like psoriasis, SLE, and lupus. These are other additions that we've put in, but the classical ones that are mentioned in the text as Kushta, Amavata, and Vata Rakta. Okay? So these are specific causative factors. It's funny that, in a lot of the autoimmune disorders, the etiology for that hasn't been determined. If you look up the causative factors for it, the cause is unknown, but the pathogenesis or the disease, it has been identified. However, no one really looks at the fact that these autoimmune disorders can definitely be related back to what the person has been eating. It just, the only thing is, it happens in such a slow process, and it just keeps building and building, that you think that it's very arbitrary to associate a person's diet with them having this autoimmune disorder. However, now we know that in classical texts, if we look at the actual pathogenesis from the Ayurvedic perspective, this is a major factor for the production and for the manifestation of these disorders. So a lot of autoimmune disorders actually are related to habitual consumption of these incompatible foods. And that again, it's people who eat this on a daily basis. Eating leftovers every single day for lunch will add up eventually. Eating foods that have been, frozen foods with lots of preservatives. We now know that. It's being proven again and again and again that the type of food that we eat really does have an impact on our health. And this is just a great example of what was there in the classical texts and how aware they were even at that time that the food that we eat, how it can eventually lead to disease. Okay, so the classical line of treatment for a person who has, for instance, if you catch this before it becomes an actual disease, if someone comes to you and they're fairly healthy and they're looking to, maintain their health or have a better diet, or they're just in that beginning stages, they haven't reached the fourth stage of samprapti, they're just in like 1, 2, or even 3. And you're asking them about their diet and you figure out that they do have Viruddha, and this may be causing them to feel some discomfort or some change from a normal state of health, then what you want to do is first stop the cause, stop the constant exposure to the cause, which is the Viruddha. If someone is habitual to consuming this, it's really hard for them to leave their leftovers. They look forward to eating their leftovers the next day. Then the best way for them to break that habit is to taper off slowly. And that tapering off procedure is known as Padamshika Krama. Krama means a gradual procedure. So there's a stepwise or stage-wise procedure. And Padamshika means it's one step at a time. So slowly, one step at a time, they want to reduce the consumption of this food. So for instance, if they're having it 3 times a day, then maybe you want to try and get rid of it, or start off with maybe having it only 2 times per day, and then slowly reduce to 1 time per day, and then maybe once every 2 days or once every 3 days, and so on and so forth. So they get into a healthy way of getting rid of that habit without then regressing back into the habit. Because if you do anything cold turkey, and this procedure is the same as what we follow for any type of habit that a person has formed. So that unhealthy habits are known as okasatmya. Satmya are the habits that we have, and okasatmya are unhealthy habits, that even though we have unhealthy habits, sometimes it doesn't necessarily produce immediate effects. That's an example of that is, for instance, a person who has steak and potatoes every night for dinner, and they're like, well, I've been eating this all my life and nothing has happened, so I don't understand what the big deal is. I don't need to change anything. But we know that eventually will add up. So in that case, it's, instead of telling them, okay, you can never have steak and potatoes again, that's it, you need to stop today, they're obviously going to regress back to that habit because they're so used to it. However, if you slowly reduce it and slowly get rid of it, then they can eventually, their body has a chance to catch up and get used to the idea of not having that. So it'll help to curb the cravings for that as well. So it's both physical and psychological. They need to get rid of those habits, because most habits are actually, they start off as a physical habit and then they eventually become a psychological habit, where it's more of our mind thinking that we need that substance or whatever that thing may be, as opposed to our body actually needing it. And eventually when it becomes a dependency, then it's your mind telling you that you need that and creating a physical reaction that if you do not get that, then it starts to create issues. So that dependency and that habitual, whatever the substance may be, has to be decreased or taken away in a slow and steady manner. Okay? So that's the first line of treatment for chikitsa of Viruddha or habitual incompatible combinations. The other next step would be, again, to increase a healthy diet, and then it can also, you can also in the second stage of treatment, or after you've gotten rid of the cause or gotten rid of the Viruddha, then you can also do shodhana, which means you would need to cleanse the body from the effects of these unhealthy habits. Such as, depending on the dosha, you can do purgation, you can do virechana or vamana, or you can advise them antidotes. So antidotes, depending on what the Viruddha is, there are certain antidotes. And basically the antidotes for here would be to increase the Agni, digest the Ama. That would be the antidote for that. And aversion to methods of treating due to Viruddha. Okay? There are certain exceptions. For instance, there are certain people who can consume Viruddhahara and still have no effects. So the same example that I just gave you, someone who eats steak and potatoes and say, I've been doing this all my life and nothing has ever happened to me. The next person who does it, they end up with heart disease. But I've been tested for everything. I have no heart disease. I'm perfectly fine. And for me, I don't see the big deal why I can't eat my steak and potatoes. And so there are exceptions. There are certain people or certain instances where Viruddhahara cannot produce effects, these unwanted effects. And the examples of that is a person who exercises regularly, who is very strong, physically strong due to this regular exercise, a person who has a very, very strong Agni, a person who's young, and who consumes only small quantities of this Viruddhahara, and one who has recently undergone oleation therapy. So you may ask, why does that matter? If someone has sneha, you would think, in fact, that would cause them to be more susceptible to Viruddha reactions. But the reason why is because when you're doing snehana, it lubricates the whole body. So because of that, the body doesn't get a chance to withhold any of the effects of the Viruddhahara. It may be there, but it would still adhere to the saturation of fat in the body due to the snehana therapy, and therefore that will get flushed out once you induce the shodhana, whichever type of shodhana you're doing. So that's why a person who is undergoing snehana or oleation therapy will not be affected by Viruddhahara. Similarly, someone who is young. So you ever notice, like, for instance, teenagers can eat whatever they want and nothing makes it a difference? That's exactly true. The reason why is because they're so young, because their body is constantly changing, and because their metabolism, their Agni naturally tends to be higher at that time, they are not really affected by the Viruddha in that stage of their life. However, once they pass on to the next stage of their life, then they are no longer in that taruna or that young, those teenage years. And if they continue with the Viruddhahara, then that's when they're going to start to see the effects of it. However, in those early years, they can consume. I'm not advising it, but there are exceptions. For instance, kids who are young or in their teenage years or younger, if they are consuming these Viruddha combinations, it can be a reason why they may not produce or show the effects of that. Okay? So that's basically the concept of Viruddhahara. Now I want to open it up for questions. I know this is a lot of stuff that I've very quickly gone over, but please let me know if you have any questions. And if you do, you can feel free to put it into the chat box, and I will answer them for you. Okay. Well, in the meanwhile, while I'm waiting for someone to type a question in, I'm going to answer. Okay, here you go. Can you put honey in warm water? You can put honey in warm water as long as it is not, as long as you see that the honey is not really melting as such. So it should be like lukewarm water. It's okay to mix the honey in there. But if the water is so warm that there's steam coming out of it, then that's the instance where you may not want to put honey in that water. But yes, but if it's cooked in cold water, then absolutely you can put honey in that water. Yeah. The milk garlic recipe, I know that's an interesting one. Everyone's wondering about that. I think I'll save that one for one of our other classes where we can actually talk about all the properties. But if you want to look it up before our class, and we'll talk some more about some recipes and some herbal formulas, you can look it up online. And the term you want to look up is Lashuna, Lashuna, Lashuna Kshita is the term for the garlic milk recipe. Lashuna is garlic and Kshita is milk. So if you want to look up the recipe for that, or you want to read up about it, you can look up Lashuna Kshita, and you'll be able to find the recipe and also some of the properties and instances where we use that. Okay. And no veg and butter, but veg and ghee are never contraindicated, are they? Also, fruit and grain, please cover. Okay. So you can add ghee to vegetables if it's being cooked. So that's the instance where it's okay. Remember, butter is very different than ghee, because butter is actually more heavy to digest because it still has the milk solids in it, whereas ghee doesn't have that. So if you're cooking your vegetables in ghee, it's okay. However, if you're cooking it with butter, it makes it even more heavy to digest. So that's another reason why you don't want to have vegetables in butter. Fruit and grains, because depending on how you're using the grains, they're most likely the grains are cooked. That's the instance for that if you're consuming fruit with grains, because you usually won't use a grain that's a raw grain. It has to be processed, or it has to be cooked, or it has to be roasted in some way, whereas fruits are fresh. So it's, again, the combination of a raw substance with a cooked substance. That's the issue with why you don't want to use fruit and grains. Okay. If it's a fruit smoothie, so it depends on what you're using, a non-dairy milk. If you're using a fruit smoothie, but it's fruits with yogurt, regardless of which type of yogurt, then that is still considered incompatible. However, if it's fruit with a non-dairy milk, like the milk, like for instance, almond milk, then to some extent, I think that should be okay. But I'm assuming that would be then fruit and milk, not necessarily a smoothie as such. Because to make a smoothie, you need yogurt, right? Or am I wrong? That's my impression. To get the consistency of a smoothie, you need to have yogurt. Whereas opposed to if you put fruits and milk and make that, that'll be not even a milkshake. It'll just be fruit flavored milk. So I'm guessing the fruit flavored milk may not be, if it's almond milk, then it can be okay. And it all depends on which fruits you're mixing. If it's fruits that are predominantly sweet in flavor, then that with the milk is still okay. If it's a citrus fruit with milk, even if it's a non-lactose milk or a non-dairy milk, it would still react with the milk. It can split the milk, or it can not combine very well with the milk. Then that would be a contraindication. Or stew fruits with grains. Yes, you can cook the fruits with the grains. So that's the exception for eating fruits. For instance, if you're like what Hillary had made for us, where she put the apples with the oatmeal and baked it. because they're cooked together, then that is something that you can have. So fruits cooked with grains is okay, but raw fruits and cooked grains, that's the one that's contraindicated. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that one. Almond milk, no yogurt. Almond milk, again, according to the fruit that you're mixing the almond milk with, it's okay as long as it's not a citrus fruit or it's not a sour fruit. So this is a good example, for instance, mangoes. This can be a little bit of a touchy subject because mango, depending on the ripeness of the mango, has different tastes. If you get the mango that is still very firm, then that mango is still sour, slightly sour in taste. But the mango that has been fully ripened and hopefully ripened naturally, not the one that, you know, they put stuff around it and they make it ripe. The naturally ripened mango, if you, for instance, if you cut it, you can tell the difference. It's not as, it's more gelatinous, it's much more soft, very juicy. That mango is sweet in taste, and that one is the one that you can actually mix with almond milk, not with regular milk, but with almond milk, it would be okay. Incompatible rasa combinations. Okay, so if we want, we can go over that as well. Because Sushruta is the one that has specifically mentioned this. And it is kind of included under the 18 types that is mentioned by Charaka, but we can go over that as well. So sweet, if it's sweet or sour, that's sweet mixed with sour or salty is Viruddha due to the taste and the potency. Okay, because sweet is cold in potency and sour and salty are hot in potency. Sweet mixed with katu or bitter, again, it's Viruddha due to the taste and the potency and the vipaka. So sweet has madhura vipaka and katu has katu vipaka. The potency of both of these, again, sweet is cold, katu is hot. So that's the reason why these are incompatible in multiple levels. Sweet mixed with bitter or astringent, it's Viruddha again due to vipaka. And this is not for every single substance that is sweet and every single substance that's bitter. Because if you look at these sweet, the Viruddha according to taste, then we can't mix anything with anything. However, when we go into the specific qualities of each and every food, they describe what are the exceptions, and they also describe what are the difference in the taste according to the maturity of that substance. Like for example, I told you about the mango. If a mango is half ripened or not fully ripened, it's still sour in taste, where when it's completely ripened, it's then sweet in taste, and it has different properties than when it is unripened. Okay. Sour, amla mixed with salty, or sour mixed with salty is Viruddha due to rasa. Again, they don't necessarily mix together because of the qualities. And if we go back again to the elemental makeup, we'll be able to see the reason why that one is Viruddha, because they're both hot in potency, so they just actually they equal hot and hot equals more hot. So that's what would happen with the sour and salty. Sour and pungent, similar issue. They're both hot, as well as they both have different vipakas. So sour amla has amla vipaka, and katu has katu vipaka. And the reason why that is different is because the vipakas are really important in, again, remember when we talked about vipaka, it has the effect on the colon and the amount of water absorption, and also the production of the quality of waste product or the stools, and the elimination of those stools. So for instance, in a sour vipaka, it tends to aggravate pitta, and it can also create somewhat loose or semi-solid stools, whereas katu vipaka actually aggravates vata and can create more drier stools. So if, for instance, if you were to mix sour and pungent, you would end up getting two different consistency in the stools. You would get somewhat watery or semi-solid stools, plus in some parts you'll end up getting somewhat dry and hard stools. This is an indication, a classic example of when you would get like the different colors in the stool. You get like some parts of it is really dark and the other parts of it is sort of like a lightish, more beige color as opposed to a brown color. So this is an example of where that may happen. Okay, the next one is sour and bitter, or sour and astringent. And that again is due to multiple levels where it's the incompatibility of the taste, the quality, the potency, and the vipaka. Okay, so in all levels, the sour, bitter, and astringent do not work together. And if you look at it, it's again, it's one is hot in potency and the others are cold in potency. So you don't necessarily want to mix those together. Okay, so like I said, the reason why Shushruta has mentioned it specifically according to taste, and this is important because for most part, if we're looking at the qualities of food, food is understood predominantly by the taste that it exhibits. So that's why this part is important to know. Again, it's not every single sweet substance or every single sour or salty substance, they don't work together. For instance, you have some substances or some food that have 3 or 4 of these tastes all in one. It's not just sweet, or it's sweet and salty and astringent. So in that case, even in the composition of that, it has all of these qualities, so it may not necessarily be Viruddha. Again, when we go into details, we just confuse you even more. But the reason for these details, the reason why the acharyas have told us this is because sometimes, every now and then, we come across certain cases that seem to be unexplainable. For instance, you look at all the nidanas, you can't find a nidana that's correlating with this. You look at the state, the avastha of the person, you can't find a reason. You look at all of the other factors, and for some reason it doesn't seem clear as to why this person has the disease. That's when we go back to all of these details. And sometimes it's just that one little factor, that one little thing that is the trigger factor for creating this disorder. So that's why when you can't, again, we have all of our checklists, but if all of our checklists, it's not pointing to that, then we need to go even more detailed to figure out if it's really a Viruddha hara or if it's something else that can be causing this disorder. Okay, so that's the reason for all of these details. Okay, next, hemp seed, fruit, and almond milk. Okay, so hemp actually tends to be very hot in potency. Again, depending on the fruit that you're using with the almond milk, you want to try, and maybe the hemp may not be such a good idea with the milk. Almonds tend to be cold in potency. If you're mixing that with a fruit such as watermelon, you wouldn't want to mix watermelon with milk. Grapes, or those are ripe grapes, by the way, or sweet grapes, or apples, or even bananas and almond milk would actually work out okay, but it would be a little bit heavy. It really depends on the specific fruit and the I don't think the hemp would really work very well with the milk, just because hemp tends to be very hot in potency. Okay, more why honey and heat are an imbalance. Honey and heat are an imbalance because honey is naturally hot in potency. This is the reason why honey is a natural antibacterial, because of and the reason why honey is hot in potency, it's because of the actual enzymes you get from the bee saliva when they make the honey. This is the qualities of honey always is applicable to raw honey. When we talk about honey, we're always talking about raw honey, not pasteurized honey. This is another reason why pasteurizing honey in itself is actually viruddha, because you're heating honey. So if you're getting pasteurized honey, you're already on the step to viruddha. But honey and heat, or honey or heating the honey, does exactly that. It enhances, or you're adding even more of this hot potency to something that is already very hot, and therefore it becomes sort of like a burnt quality. It also induces the qualities of consuming burnt food in the person. And it can also induce burning sensation, the effects of poison. So for instance, poison is something in Ayurveda, Visha, or Visha Dravyas are very tikshna, they're very penetrating, they're very ushna, they're very hot in potency. They're vyavai, they absorb immediately and they disperse immediately, vyavai and vikashi. They're absorbed and dispersed very quickly throughout the body. That's the effect of a poison. And they say that when honey is heated, naturally already having a hot potency where you're heating it and enhancing more of that hot potency, when that is consumed, it produces the same results as if you were to consume visha or poison. So it will be tikshna, penetrating, extremely ushna, very hot, vyavai and vikashi, which means it's absorbed immediately and disperses immediately. That's why immediately it can produce that extreme burning sensation, irritation. Depending on the state of the person, it can also result in murcha or fainting, or sort of that disorientation. It can, for instance, if the person is a pitta prakriti person, or they have a very high pitta condition and they consume that honey that is very hot, that could be the trigger factor to push it over the top, where they will have that severe reaction. So that's one of the main reasons why we do not heat honey. It's considered very incompatible. In fact, there have been studies to look at this. There was a study done by someone I know who was doing their master's in Swastavrita, and that's community health or preventative care, actually. And in that, they found that by heating the honey, it does produce, of course, they administered very small doses of it, but they found that it does produce the similar effects as described in Ayurveda for consuming visha. Okay. That's a great question. Having all 6 tastes in a meal, the reason it balances is because it has all 5 of the elements. It's a good combination of all 5 elements. And that's the reason why, even though there's so much incompatibility with the tastes, when your food has all 6 tastes and is cooked very well, that actually gives your body enough nutrition with all 5 elements in it. And that's why we want to have that sort of nutrition. So it completely nourishes the body on all level. And remember, we talked about when you're consuming when you're consuming food and it's breaking down in the stomach, it breaks down, and there's some subtle portion of the Jataragni also has the Bhutagnis, or the Agni that is responsible for separation of all 5 elements. So that's the reason why we want to have that food that has all 6 tastes, because if it is all 6 tastes and it is cooked externally and made into a homogeneous good mixture, or properly evenly cooked food, then it's very easy for our body to then digest that and further break it down so that all 5 elements in the body gets nourished by that type of food. Okay. Let's see. I can't seem to find the other questions here. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Let me see. Did I get everybody's questions? And yeah, I can't seem to get the other questions here because there was an overload of questions. But if you want to, if that's okay, you can turn your microphone on and ask the question, because there are no more questions that are showing up on the chat, on my chat. So if you want, if there's a question that I haven't answered that you asked, if you wouldn't mind turning on your microphone and just quickly asking the question, so that we can cover that as well. Any more questions? Okay. If not, in the meanwhile, you know, feel free to interrupt me if you need to ask your question. But there was another question that we were that got sent earlier about takra, and so the question was, can we add organic maple syrup or cardamom or raw honey if someone doesn't like the sour taste of the milk? And to answer that question, if, for instance, if someone doesn't like the taste of the takra, but they still need to take it, you can add spices that would enhance the flavor. However, whatever you add to the takra should be something that is equivalently digestive in nature. So, for instance, to answer specifically the examples, organic maple syrup and raw honey would not be a good idea, because that actually would end up being Viruddha here, as well as they're not necessarily so digestive in nature. The honey is digestive in nature if it's taken alone, but honey mixing with the takra would be Viruddha. So therefore, it would be, again, the hot potency, and so that's the reason you do not want to mix the honey with the takra. However, the cardamom is a good idea, because cardamom is a digestive spice. It has a mild digestive nature, so you can add cardamom to that. That is okay if the person would prefer that sort of taste. Another example of a digestive spice that the person might like, for instance, is cinnamon or cloves. These are all, they're more fragrant spices. However, they are all still digestive in nature. So if, to kind of give a little and let them, you know, be satisfied taste-wise, those are this kind of spices, those fragrant spices that can be also be mixed in with the takra. For instance, if they don't like the cumin powder, or they don't like black pepper, or they don't like ajwain, then you can do that. They're not the most ideal, but they're still digestive. Their level of digestive quality is slightly less than these other spices. However, they're still mild digestive. So just to convince the person to take the takra in the first place, you can give a little, and they can still use like cardamom or cinnamon or cloves. I think those are the only fragrant ones that I can think of that are digestive in nature. Okay, if I think of any others, I'll let you know. Takra gets heated due to the blender. Is it still good? It doesn't need to be refrigerated, but if it's getting heated when you're making takra, if it gets heated with the blender, then it's not necessarily going to separate all the butter. And even in making takra, for instance, if it is due to a vata issue, a little bit of butter that remains, it's okay. If it's due to a pitta issue, in that case also, if it's a little bit of butter remaining, it's still okay. Only in the kapha conditions you want to make sure that you get all the butter out. Okay, so you can give a little even in that, because actually classically they have described For vata, you don't necessarily need to take all the fat out. You can take out half of the fat and it's okay. For pitta, you can take out around 3/4 of the fat. It's okay. But for kapha, you want to take out all of the fat. That's the kind of takra that is necessary for kapha. Okay, so that's like ama, sama kapha, or sama pitta, or sama vata. So if you're using a blender that is heating up the takra in the process, that's probably not a good idea, because that means that heat is going to melt the fat back into the mixture, and it won't separate. If it's too hot, or even if it's too warm, the fat will not separate. Okay, so you might want to have a better blender, and this is the one instance why you kind of want to have room temperature water or cool water, because that cool water helps to keep the actual mixture or the content cool, and so therefore the butter easily separates from the liquid. Okay. You do not need to refrigerate this. And this is kind of hard in the summertime. So the best way to store this is by keeping it in one of those thermos or coolers that tend to keep whatever liquid you put into it cool. That's the way to store this. But it's better not to refrigerate it, because again, you will be inducing too much of a cold quality to it, and therefore that also can cause ama. It's the same thing like we tell people not to drink things straight out of the fridge, or not to drink iced beverage. So we do not want to create this wonderful thing called takra and then stick it in the fridge and turn it into something that's not good. So you're better off just, when you make it, put it in one of those thermoses that kind of keep things cool. I've seen, or if you have a ceramic jug, that's a wonderful thing to keep it cool as well. A ceramic jug or a clay jug. I know you may not necessarily find a clay one so easily, but you'll get a ceramic one, and that tends to keep it quite cool. That's a better way than to put it in the fridge. Okay. And some of the fat surfaces. If, for instance, if you're making it and some of the fat surfaces, it depends on how much. I mean, if it's just a few droplets of the fat, that's okay. Like I said, if it's only in the case of kapha, you kind of want to make sure that most of the fat is gone. And if the fat surfaces, all you have to do is just scoop it out, because it's the exact same thing what you did in the process of making the takra. So if you store it and some of the fat surfaces, just decant the fat from the top and still use the liquid. The liquid is the main part that you need. Okay. Okay. Yes, that is what I did. Okay, great. Great. Okay. So the next question that we had, I have time for one more question before we run out of time. For Grahini, what are the notable signs that can be detected on the tongue aside from the foul smell of the breath? So this, we kind of went over this, but I'll just repeat it just in case. Depending on the chronicity of the condition, you're going to find that thick layer, that white thick layer at the back of the tongue or at the root of the tongue. That really indicates how much of ama is there. That's the indicator for ama in general, regardless of if the person has grahani or not. But you do want to look for ama, because ama will be present in grahani. In order for it to exist, ama has to be there. So you're going to be looking for according to the chronicity, you're going to be looking for how much of ama is actually there. And according to how long the person has had this, it'll be indicated on the thickness of the layer of the coating on the tongue, and how much it has progressed towards the tip of the tongue. So it starts at the root of the tongue, and it just keeps moving forward and forward or forward according to how long the person has had it. Another quick thing to notice, and I think you guys would have known this already, but I'm still going to share it. In a vata, a sama vata condition, the layer in the tongue tends to be quite thick. Sometimes it can be white or gray, and it usually has cracks. Whenever there's cracks, it indicates a sama vata condition. Okay, whenever there is sama pitta, the layer, the thickness doesn't necessarily have to be very thick. It can depend. However, in sama pitta, the coating usually is a yellowish color, or more of a yellowish sort of cream beige kind of tinge. It's not white, and that almost always is associated with the foul smell, and can be also associated with the acid reflux. In sama pitta or the pittaja type of grahini, you're going to notice that. In the kaphaja, sama kapha, you're going to notice that it can be a thick white or even to like a pale yellowish tinge. The coating tends to be very, very thick, and can also be sometimes gray, definitely with a foul smell. And maybe also associated, they'll tell you that they feel like there is a layer on their palate, a coating on their palate. Recently, actually just yesterday, I heard this description that the tongue feels fuzzy. And that fuzzy feeling of the tongue also is typically sort of a kaphaja, or sama kapha presentation. Okay? So that's kind of what you should be looking for. Again, the thickness really depends on the chronicity. If it has just recently started to happen, or if it's just a few months, the thickness may not necessarily be so bad. But the longer the person has it, or the more amount of ama that the person has, that is what determines how thick or how much of the ama actually is there, and how much it has started to descend towards the tip of the tongue. Okay? Okay. So I think hopefully we got to everybody's questions. Again, we're coming towards the end of our class for today, but if you guys have questions along the way, or as you're revising, or you're going through all the notes and everything that we talked about, please feel free to send the questions to me or to Hillary or to Gerard, to all of us, and we will try to make sure and get to it on the next class, or I can email you and help you with your questions. Okay, and I will make sure to send you guys out the case format that I typically follow. It's like I said, it's basically a case sheet, and it does include all of the factors of Dashavida Pariksha and Ashtavida Pariksha and Panchanidana. However, it's sort of dispersed, and it works pretty well. I find I like the flow of the questions and the options that they have. So I think even if you want to adopt that, that's really up to you, whichever you feel comfortable with. But for case presentations, I think this method or this form is very efficient, that we can quickly go through what's happening, and in case we missed anything, we'll be able to make sure that we have that information to figure out exactly what's going on or what's complex about that, and then we need to look at their situation so we can figure out what's the most appropriate measure of intervention. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a very good night, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Thanks, Anisha. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, thank you.